Yeah, no, I think it's really cool. But we kind of talked about it a little bit before we got into the podcast. We just thought it would be kind of an interesting topic to talk about, just like psychedelics, because hey, that's a cool thing. We're gonna be like the Joe Rogan podcast, you know, where we talk about just drugs and everything. But Remy, he's really into like spirituality, and he just has like a lot of knowledge of like what psychedelics could do with mental health. So Remy, if you want to just talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, so I am currently studying psychedelics in mental health and that kind of overlap, and kind of how we can use these different psychedelics to treat different sorts of mental illnesses. Like, for instance, there are studies that have shown that a single high dose of magic mushrooms, or a series of 2 or 3 high doses in a controlled and supervised setting, can be incredibly helpful in the treatment of major depressive disorder and other related diseases. So that is some really promising research that we're looking at in the field of psychology that honestly we haven't had the kind of space to talk about in the realm of psychology since the late 1950s, early 1960s, before the kind of war on drugs was started. But we are getting a lot of progress in, especially with like the way that these drugs are scheduled and the way that its research is being set up now. I know Oregon just legalized psychedelic mushrooms. There is a dispensary in, I believe, San Francisco, and there are a few dispersed throughout Colorado. So we're seeing a lot of interesting and really promising developments in that sort of space. Yeah.
I honestly, I just want to say, like, I would be 100% down to try, like, magic mushrooms and all that. Like, I know you, Blake, are not very prominent on taking them because you're such in a good headspace right now, but, like, I'm not saying I'm not in a good headspace, but, like, I don't know. I'm just curious, like, what kind of, like, opens up in your head, like.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of interesting, like, Remy, you and me were talking about, like, the stone to ape theory. Like, yeah. I like to believe that that's true, that, like, our ancient ancestors just took a bunch of mushrooms and then got big-brained.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, and there's a few different facets to that type of theory. Like, there's the prominent one that everyone talks about. It's like, literally, we ate mushrooms, and then our brains grew and developed into more complex things and more complex machines that have better wiring and are more efficient, and we're able to develop things like language and communication and the way that we use tools and stuff, which is a little bit more highly scrutinized than a theory that I think a lot of professionals in human evolution would semi-agree with, is that we've interacted with these psychedelic compounds, whether it be mushrooms or DMT in the form of like acacia or ayahuasca or any sorts of those compounds. Like, we've been interacting with these compounds for hundreds of thousands of years. Like, we know that they existed in the Valley of Life, where human evolution kind of picked up and where we got really smart really fast, and we know that we interacted with them. So kind of the question is, how much did they have to do with it? That's up for debate, but I think most people would agree that it had something to do with it.
So hypothetically speaking, if we fed our pets psychedelic mushrooms, we'd be able to talk to our dogs with evolution and all that. So, like, let's say we start breeding dogs with psychedelic mushrooms.
Okay.
I can't advise
Maybe.
that, but I mean, in 100,000 years, I mean, that's so unethical. But like, if you had proposed that 40 years ago, I'm sure some scientists would have been like, in the FBI would have been like, yeah, let's throw that on top of all that crazy stuff that they were doing back in the 60s with Project MK Ultra.
I was just about to bring that up.
Yeah.
Dude, just give Bunny the dog a button that says shrooms and then they can consent. Like, it's okay.
The little buttons that make dogs
Yeah, literally. But Remy, I actually have a question for you about
Yeah.
how we've been interacting with psychedelics through
Yeah.
all this time, through history. How do you think that's played a role in religion and spirituality? Do you think there's any connection between psychedelics and those two topics?
Well, my personal belief, and I get a lot of flack for this from religious scholars, is that the basic idea that religion has, and this is consistent with a lot of experience of psychedelic users, is that, like, a common thing that you'll hear from psychedelics users is like, if you take enough, you'll see God, or you'll meet God, or you'll be face to face with God. And it's like, well, if these people were seeing God and interacting with God, doesn't it stand to reason that they were humans just like us, so they needed some other inputs to access that type of spirituality? And there's a lot of evidence that is really interesting and really promising that like, for instance, there are some sects of Christianity where magic mushrooms are a holy sacrament and are to be treated with highest respect, and that everyone should partake in this holy sacrament. And that doesn't really align with modern medical research. We think that there are certain types of people that have genetic coding that makes them disposed to like HPPD, which is the prolonged instance of a psychedelic trip that can affect for years and years after you take it, or schizoid incidents, like on the schizophrenia spectrum after psychedelic use. So we know that this is a risk and it can trigger these types of things, but we also know a lot about it, so we can do these as long as we're doing these things responsibly, and we're progressing the way that we have been, which has been very slowly. We've been doing it the right way through the proper legal systems, and it's been a really great field to hop into now because of all the leeway that we've gotten in the law so far.
Yeah, definitely.
You probably won't be able to hear it like in the thing, but Lincoln just pressed a sound on my thing that does like the didn't like that. He made a joke, so that's just what we heard. But no, I think all of it's like really interesting, and I like the idea that, or like the story in the Bible where like Moses was listening to the burning bush, like how that was like said to be like just someone like going through a trip.
Yeah. I mean, we can hypothesize that the burning bush story, if it actually took place, which that's obviously a widely debated issue, if the things in the Bible actually took place, but if it were to have taken place, it's quite possible that it could have been a small acacia tree that was on fire. And we know that acacia, in the bark of an acacia tree, exists 5-MeO-DMT, or dimethyltryptamine, which is the strongest psychedelic substance that is known to humankind. And it makes sense that in this story, there were people walking by the burning bush, and they didn't stop and they didn't observe it. But when Moses stopped and observed it, he started having visions and hearing God. And so, essentially, what he did was nature made him smoke DMT. Like, is my hypothesis of that. Well, I've done a lot of study into research. I just took a class last semester at ASU about research of religion in the modern world, and how kind of the secular frame that we have for research for the progression of religion, how we separate the religious and the secular, and then we develop the two independently, and then they fall out from each other and they separate and become two opposing factors or factions. We don't see that in other societies that are still maintain religious, what we call embeddedness, or like the amount to which you are interacting with the church or religious authority. So like in Muslim countries, we see a high level of religious embeddedness, and we don't see a strong frame for secularization. So it stands to reason that the amount to which they interact with religion isn't going to drastically decrease like it did in Western society, because they don't have a framework for it like we specifically set up a framework for the secularization and separation of church and state and stuff like that.
I know, like, we're kind of diving into, like, kind of spirituality, so, like, I kind of want to hear what everyone's kind of, like, spiritual ideas of life are. Taylor hasn't jumped in a while, so I'll have Taylor go first.
Okay, well, I feel like on the topic of psychedelics and connecting that to spirituality, in my experience talking to people who have done psychedelics, it's kind of like a segue into spiritual thinking, because, you know, I've heard that it's very much like you are connected with everything around you. You are one with the universe and everything that the universe is. Like, it's not necessarily that there's a universe and then there's you, it's that you are the universe. And I think that kind of thinking is very much a product of psychedelic use. So with that being said, like, I've had these experiences talking to these people who have done psychedelics, and I feel like it's kind of reflected on my own perception of spirituality, and now I start to understand how they feel so connected with everything, you know? Like, personally, I do consider myself a pretty spiritual person. I think I'm here on this planet experiencing life as a human, if that makes sense. Like, that's like my purpose here, is just to experience life as a human.
I thought you were here experiencing it as a frog.
No, for real, dude. But I feel like I recently realized I had the most spiritual conversation of my life on the floor of my bathroom on a Friday night in Isla Vista with one of my really, really close friends. And I realized that I'm a new soul. And I just, like, it was incredible. Like, during this conversation, we were in there for, like, literally, like, an hour and a half just talking and meditating and crying, because everything we were saying just felt so real. And in that moment, like, I was able to distinguish between the ego and the higher self, which is something I've never done before. I know what the ego and higher self are, but in this moment, I realized that my ego is the reason that I've been anxious in the past, but my higher self is this new soul that's put on earth to experience everything, just to experience it, you know, like the highs and lows, all of that comes with it. So after this conversation and after, like, talking to all my friends about, like, their experiences on psychedelics, I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of spirituality, and I really want to continue to explore that and see how it can affect my life.
Clap.
Mini clap.
Or Lincoln, you want to?
Yeah.
As Lincoln, you want to go next? Just talk about spirituality a little bit.
In my experience, like, I don't know too many people that have done psychedelics, but I mean, for me, I'd consider myself, like, not atheist, but I do believe in, like, a higher power. My dad himself.
Deist. You believe in a god, but you don't.
Okay, deist. But my dad actually, he considers himself Taoist, which is basically, it's basically like how animals and us human beings and, like, every living thing is, like, connected by the universe and everything. Mm-hmm. Like, I haven't done too much, like, deep dive into Taoism, but, like, I have, like, a broad idea about it. But personally, I believe there's, like, a higher power. There might be an afterlife, but that's kind of it when it comes to spirituality for me.
Yeah. I also kind of had the same conversation with Remy. Like, I kind of believe in, like, the idea of, like, the egg theory. And so I fucking love the egg theory. I feel like I've already told everyone what this is, but I'm going to just say it again for the podcast. But basically, it's kind of like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? You know, what came first, you or God? So basically, like, God puts you on the earth as, like, a soul, but, like, he could put you, like, anywhere in history. Like, say, like, I don't know, the first time he ever reincarnates me, I'm, like, a Roman in ancient history, whatever. And so I go through life, and then I become more enlightened after that life, and then when I die, I meet God again, and then he sends me back. But eventually, I'll go through, like, all the lives of everyone. So my soul is you, I'm Taylor, I'm Remy, I'm everyone. But it's just, like, different soul going through different stages.
All different iterations of the same soul. We're different chapters in the same soul's life. And we're just all doing it over and over again.
And eventually, once you become so enlightened, you just there's no need to be put back, so you just become God.
You are God. That's a very spiritual theory right there, because that's exactly, like, that ties into what you were talking about too, Lincoln. Like, what'd you call it? Theism? Taoism? Yeah. Taoism. That ties into Taoism completely, because I feel like we are connected with everything because we're this same soul that's being reincarnated over and over until we become God, you know? Like, it's so fascinating to think about that. And then that just, sorry, I know you want to jump in, but that just kind of makes me think that the people you attract in your life are reflections of these souls that you need to experience, because you are kind of everybody you attract, you know? Like, I feel like in each person you meet, there's a reflection of you, and at that point, it might be something that you need to see and experience. And I just think that's really interesting because, you know, it's just all about the journey as a soul to be reincarnated. Once again, it's about what you can learn in each individual life.
And, oh, sorry, did you want to? I was just going to say, like, and, like, I watched this thing with Neil deGrasse Tyson where he kind of explained how the universe works, and it kind of made me, like, really feel like it was real, where he said, like, basically, whenever the universe ends, it's going to either end, like, super cold death of the universe or super hot. But then, like, eventually, like, there's a chance where, like, another Big Bang can happen. So it's like, oh, that idea is, like, forever, like, exploding, coming back together for, like, infinity, and, like, life has just always existed. Like, we just can't comprehend that it's, like, always been happening for, like, forever.
Well, if you look at life and death as, or life itself as a dynamic state that is either on or off, it is a binary thing. You are either living or you are dying. And excuse me, throughout life, you go through multiple stages where you are living and dead. And this is a kind of an old spiritual view. I don't know that it comes from a specific culture or belief system, but essentially at every junction in your life, at every point where there's a major change, for example, when you are a teenager becoming an adult, or when you get married, or when you have kids, there is an aspect of you that is dying and an aspect of you that is being reborn. So when you become an adult, and this may happen for some people never. Some people never grow out of emotional adolescence. But once you grow out of emotional adolescence, you experience an aspect of yourself dying because your inner teenager is growing up into this adult, and that requires a death of a certain aspects of you. That requires the death of, like, I don't know, a lot of teenagers will, like, be really angsty and hate the world. And I know that's a stereotype, but that certainly described me for the longest time. And now I see, like, within all of this ugliness that is the world that we've done, we're doing some pretty freaking amazing things too. Like, we're for all of the good, there is bad. And I don't know that the good can outweigh the bad, but you have to find the good in the bad. Otherwise, there's no hope.
And that's well, in Taoism, this, like,